I was enjoying my weekend lounging on the couch when the phone rang. The screen lit up with a familiar name, and I hesitated for a second, holding my breath, before answering. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Hi, Ruby, how are you?" That soft, slightly insinuating tone was painfully familiar to me. Mom always said that when she wanted something. I stretched, took a deep breath, and braced myself for the conversation. "I'm fine. Just relaxing." "What happened?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as if she was considering how to approach the subject. "Well, I need to ask you a small favor." I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose with my fingers. "Sure." "Service." I already knew in advance what I was going to hear right now. "Your brother just moved out of his apartment. He's out of a lease, and he's in temporary financial trouble." I sighed. Jake was 26, 4 years younger than me, but it seemed that he had never been able to get out of the eternal state of uncertainty that he had been in all his adult life. He jumped from job to job, from one relationship to another, always finding excuses for why he couldn't do anything. "Mom, where is this all going?" I asked, even though I knew the answer perfectly well. "Well, you have an empty apartment after your divorce from Mark." Her voice rose a little, as it always did when she was trying to make something less significant than it really was. "Jake needs somewhere to stay until he gets back on his feet." I thought. Maybe he could stay there for a while he sorted everything out. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This apartment was my financial safety net. After the divorce 3 years ago, I kept it for myself as part of an agreement with my ex-husband. 2 years later, I bought a new one, better, in a more prestigious area, but with a big mortgage. My plan was simple: to rent out the old apartment to cover part of the payments. "Mom, I was planning to rent this place out," I reminded her. "I know, honey," she said, a conciliatory note creeping into her voice, "but we're talking about family. Jake really needs help right now. You're doing so well in your marketing job, and he's struggling. It would just be temporary." Temporarily, in Jake's vocabulary, meant anything but for a while. I knew perfectly well that if I refused, my mother would raise this issue at every family meeting in the next decade, artfully hinting at how I abandoned my brother in a difficult moment. "Okay," I said after a long pause. "He can stay there temporarily. But I mean temporarily. Thank you, honey. Jake will be so grateful. I'll tell him right now." Before I could add a single condition, she had already hung up. I dropped the phone on the pillow and groaned loudly. So much for my rental income. A week later, I met Jake at the apartment. He was standing at the entrance with 2 battered bags and a backpack that looked like it had survived 100 trips. "Hi, sis," he said cheerfully, opening his arms. "Thanks for that. You're just a savior." I could smell the faint smell of cigarettes and alcohol coming from him. "Yeah," I muttered, opening the door. "As I already told Mom, it's temporary." The apartment was clean, empty, and minimally furnished with the furniture I had left behind. Jake looked around with interest, then dropped the things right on the floor. "I'm going to need to rent this place out, Jake," I continued. "So I have a few rules." "Come on, sis, shoot," he grinned. I crossed my arms. "First of all, no outsiders without my permission. Secondly, clean up after yourself. Third, no noisy parties. Fourth, no pets." Jake held up his hands. "Perfectly reasonable. I promise to be the perfect tenant. You won't even notice that I'm here." I nodded, but inside I already felt that this was just the beginning. I took a deep breath, feeling the anger that I was trying my best to contain boiling up inside me. This moment was inevitable. I knew it from the very beginning. I knew that Jake would not be able to keep his word, that one day I would have to face this, but I did not think that it would happen so soon and in such a blatant form. I slowly looked around the room, and my gaze caught on the empty beer bottle scattered on the coffee table, on the overturned glass with the remains of wine frozen on the white tablecloth with a sticky stain, on the shoes lying chaotically at the entrance, as if a hurricane had passed here. The apartment, which had been neat and tidy until recently, now looked as if no one had cleaned it for months. "Were you going to tell me?" My voice was deceptively calm, but inside, everything was shaking with indignation. "When, Jake? When will the whole city settle here? When will I come in and find that you're renting out rooms based on ads?" "Come on, Ruby, you're exaggerating," he began, but I held up my hand, silencing him. "I've set one single rule," I glared at his face, where guilt and annoyance were mixed. "One damn simple rule. No outsiders. Never mind." That was my only request. "But no, of course you couldn't do it." "Come on," Amber interjected, folding her arms over her chest. "You're acting like a mother hen. Jake is an adult man. He doesn't need to ask his older sister for permission to live with him." I whirled on her. "Oh, really? Then maybe this grown man could at least pay the rent, since he feels so confident in his apartment." Amber grimaced, but didn't answer. I looked at Jake again, and now there was a flash of annoyance in his eyes. "Listen, you don't understand." He ran his hand through his hair, trying to find the words. Amber found herself in a difficult situation. She had nowhere to go. "So why did it suddenly become my problem?" I burst out. "Why should I deal with the consequences of your decisions? How long has she lived here?" My voice sounded icy. "Well, a couple of weeks," he muttered, lowering his eyes. "A couple of weeks?" I felt a storm rising inside me. "So you've been lying to me for 2 weeks, looking into my eyes, saying that you live alone, that everything is fine, that the apartment is clean and the bills are paid?" He shifted uncomfortably, but still didn't say a word. I ran my hand over my face, trying to stop my fingers from shaking. "That's it." I pressed my lips into a thin line. "You're moving out." Jake looked up sharply. "Ruby, no, you can't do that." "I can. And I do. You know that this is the only place that brings me income, and I decided to use it anyway as a free hotel. I'm not going to take it anymore." Amber rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, calm down. No need to create a drama. We're just—" "I'm not talking to you," I snapped, and she immediately shut her mouth. Jake swallowed hard. "Sis, I promise, No, Jake. Promises don't mean anything anymore. You should move out by the end of the week." His face froze, and then slowly distorted with anger. "Would you really do that? With my own brother?" "Yes, because my own brother has already done this to me." I turned around and headed for the door, feeling a cocktail of anger, pain, and frustration bubbling inside me. It was inevitable. And now I had to see if he would keep his word for once. Mom frowned and shook her head, just like she did when she thought I was picking on her. "Oh, Ruby, honey, you probably just misunderstood. Amber is very caring. She helped me with the dishes and even offered to pick Jake up after his shift. Isn't that cute?" I blinked in disbelief. I could barely hold back a bitter laugh. Caring? The word had nothing to do with the arrogant grin she gave me as she stood at the door of my apartment. But Mom, of course, saw only the good in people, especially when it came to Jake. "Are you sure you weren't too hard on her?" my mother added, and at that moment my father put down his fork, frowning at me. "Ruby, I understand that you're used to controlling everything, but Jake is an adult. If he decided to live with this girl, then that's what he needs. Besides, you let her stay, right?" I gritted my teeth. I allowed it because I knew that if you heard a different version of the story, you would side with him, as always. Mom frowned, and there was a tense silence in the room. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I didn't want to make a scene, but I was seething with indignation. Why did it always turn out that I, an adult, responsible, well off, someone who always kept my life under control, turned out to be bad? Was Jake allowed to be a carefree boy again, still playing with life instead of living it? I finished the rest of my dinner in silence, trying not to look at my parents, and soon left, citing fatigue. That night, I lay in bed for a long time, tossing and turning and replaying the meeting with Amber in my head, and the more I thought, the more anxious I felt. There was something wrong with this girl. Not just her manners, not just how easily she settled into the apartment, as if it were a matter of course. There was something in her gaze, in her tone, that made me feel uncomfortable. For the next few weeks, I tried to stay away. I did not enter the apartment without warning, although the desire to check what was going on there made me sick inside. Sometimes I'd call Jake, asking if everything was okay, and he'd always respond with the same cheerful nonchalance that only annoyed me. "It's great, Ruby. Amber and I just watched a movie, and we're relaxing." Or, "I made dinner." Can you imagine? Real stakes. Amber was thrilled. He talked about her as if she were the center of his universe, and that worried me. But then little things started happening that I couldn't ignore. One evening, after returning from work, I received a notification from the bank. A payment for furniture delivery had been debited from my account. At first I thought it was some kind of mistake, but when I went into the transaction history, I saw that the amount was spent on a new sofa. To my apartment. I dialed Jake's number. "Hi, Ruby." He answered as if nothing had happened. "Jake, what the hell? Why did the money for the furniture go out of my account?" There was a pause, and then his voice became cautious. "Oh, yes, I was going to tell you about that. You know, the old sofa was, well, not very good. Amber accidentally spilled wine on it and it didn't wash off, so we decided to replace it." "Did you decide to replace my sofa for my money?" "Well, yes, but, Ruby, this is for all of us. You come here sometimes, too." I gripped the phone so tightly that my fingers turned white. "Jake, this isn't your house. This is my home. You can't just spend my money without permission." "Amber said you wouldn't mind," he murmured. "Amber?" "Sure. I don't care what Amber said," I said. "You're giving me my money back tomorrow." Okay, don't get mad," he sighed. "I'll see what I can do." But I knew he wouldn't do anything. The next day I went to see them. The apartment was perfectly clean, but it only increased my anxiety. Jake had never been tidy, and now there was an almost ostentatious order around, as if someone had prepared in advance for my arrival. I didn't see the old sofa. It was replaced by a huge light gray corner monster that didn't fit into the interior at all. Amber was sitting on it, legs crossed over her legs, reading a magazine. She smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. I ignored her and looked at my brother. "Where's the receipt?" "What check?" Amber pursed her lips. "For the sofa. You'll get him back, right?" Amber rolled her eyes. "Oh, Ruby, are you really making a drama out of this? We bought a new sofa. Isn't it logical for whoever owns the apartment to invest in improving it?" I opened my mouth, but there were no words. She said it so calmly, so confidently, as if I really had to thank them for choosing the furniture at my expense. I turned to Jake, but he just shrugged. "Amber's right," he murmured. Then I realized that the situation was getting out of control. I couldn't just let it go. Once inside, I immediately felt the pungent smell of alcohol, mixed with something sweet and suffocating, reminiscent of cheap incense, which seemed to be desperately trying to drown out the persistent smell of tobacco and alcohol that permeated the air. The living room could not be called a living space. Rather, it looked like a battlefield after a grand celebration, the traces of which had not been bothered to erase. Empty bottles, plastic cups, Dirty plates with dried food leftovers were strewn on the floor, and the sofa was littered with crumpled clothes, blankets, and what looked like someone's forgotten backpack. There was an overflowing ashtray on the coffee table, smoking its last smoldering cigarette butt. I took a deep breath, trying not to suffocate from all this mixture of smells, and slowly turned to Jake, who had already closed the door behind me and was now shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other, avoiding my gaze. Amber, on the other hand, crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me with an expression of open irritation, as if I had disturbed the peace of their house, and not the other way around. Explain. Right now, I said, crossing my arms and trying not to let my voice rise to a scream. Jake sighed heavily, ran a hand through his hair, then looked at me with the expression of a guilty schoolboy caught in the act. Ruby, look, it's not what you think. Really? I raised my eyebrows sarcastically, looking around the trashed apartment. Because I think that you have violated absolutely all the agreements that you and I have made. You dragged your girlfriend into my apartment without permission, raised my utility bills, threw parties despite the rule against them, and to top it all off, changed the locks without even bothering to tell me. I took a step forward, feeling rage throbbing in my temples. This is my apartment, Jake. And you dare not let me into my own house? Amber snorted loudly, rolling her eyes. God, you're so dramatic, she drawled with a tight smile. We just did what was logical. It's our home now, too. I whirled around to face her, feeling my patience drain away faster than the water in the sink she'd left open. No, Amber, I said. This is my house. You live here because I let you. But you know what? I've changed my mind. You both pack up and get out of here. You can't do this, Amber said icily, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. I grinned at him. I can. Because, let me remind you, the lease agreement is signed in my name. This is my property. Jake looked shocked. Ruby, please. We're a family. Yes, we are a family, I interrupted sharply. But that doesn't give you the right to ignore my trust and wipe your feet on me. Amber shot Jake a warning look, then turned back to me. Listen, maybe we could come to an agreement. Her voice became softer, almost insinuating, but I didn't let myself be fooled. Negotiate? I grinned at him. You didn't care about my opinion until you realized that you could be left without a roof over your head. I turned to my brother. You have 2 days, Jake. After that, if you don't vacate the apartment, I'll call the police. That was the limit. The last straw in that dirty, overflowing vessel of my patience, which has endured arrogance, disrespect, and outright disregard for my rights for too long. I looked at Amber, whose nostrils were flaring with rage, and at Jake, who, although he looked confused, still did not realize the gravity of the situation. I didn't have to shout. There was no need to threaten. All I had to do was let them know that there was no turning back. A week, I repeated, feeling an icy calm flow through my veins, suppressing any emotions except confidence. You can't do this. Amber shouted, stamping her foot like a petulant child. This is illegal. I crossed my arms over my chest and shook my head slowly, almost lazily. Oh, I can. And I will. You have no contract, no rights, and no legitimate reason to stay here. This is my apartment. These are my terms. Are you seriously going to throw your own brother out on the street? Jake's voice was shaky, full of hurt and shock, but to my surprise, there was no anger in it, just a kind of tired helplessness, as if he finally began to realize that he had gone too far. I'm not throwing you out on the street, I replied calmly, looking him straight in the eye. I'm giving you the opportunity to fix a mistake, find another place and live the way you want, without having to follow my rules. Isn't that what you wanted? Jake clenched his jaw, looking away. You're not even going to give us a chance to fix this. I laughed briefly, mirthlessly, shaking my head. A chance? Jake, I've given you so many chances that I've lost count. I've put up with the dirt, the noisy parties, your endless excuses. I was trying to be understanding. I was trying to be a good sister. But you didn't just cross the border, you built a wall of stone and then nailed it down so that I couldn't even get close. Amber snorted again, pursing her lips. Drama, drama, drama. You can't even let us live here normally. You keep walking around with that disgusting look of yours, as if someone has offended you. Live normally? I spread my arms wide, showing them the scattered bottles, dirty plates, and a broken chair in the corner of the room. Is that what you call living normally? You don't even clean up after yourself, you behave like pigs, and yet you think I have to put up with it in silence? Amber opened her mouth, ready to object, but I held up my hand, cutting her off. That's enough. I've said my piece. You won't be here in a week. Jake sighed heavily, rubbing his face with his hands, and for the first time in this entire conversation, he looked really exhausted. Where should we go? It's not my problem, I replied evenly. You're a grown man, Jake. You chose this path yourself. Now deal with the consequences. Wonderful, Amber said, crossing her arms. It's just wonderful. First you say you're kicking us out, and now you're abandoning us to our fate. Beautiful sister. I inhaled slowly, holding back my irritation. It's called setting boundaries, Amber. You don't seem to be familiar with this concept. I turned around and went to the door, but before I went out, I looked over my shoulder. Oh, and one more thing. If you don't move out in a week, I'll call the police. And believe me, you won't like it. I didn't wait for their response. She just stepped out the door and closed the door, leaving them in an apartment that was about to cease to be their home. I nodded silently, feeling a strange mixture of relief, fatigue, and bitterness flare up in the depths of my soul. There was so much in that short answer, their complete defeat, their realization that the game they had so confidently entered was over, and even a certain shadow of wounded dignity. Jake did not beg, did not justify himself, just acknowledged the reality that I had imposed on them. I shifted my gaze to Amber, watching as she bit her lip irritably and stuffed clothes into a suitcase as if she were fighting with her. Her every move expressed rage, disagreement, protest. You won, she muttered, not looking up. Congratulations. I didn't answer. What was there to say? It was not a triumph, but rather an inevitable outcome, which she herself contributed to. If she had at least a little respect for boundaries, at least a little bit tried to get along, everything could have turned out differently. But now it was too late. I stepped further into the living room and noticed that many of my things were gone. Where's my coffee table? I asked, looking around the space where the carved wooden table I brought back from my trip to Spain used to stand. Jake hesitated, scratched his head, and I realized I wasn't going to like the answer. We should have lit something in the fireplace, he muttered, avoiding my gaze. It was as if something had collapsed in my chest. I felt a surge of rage, but I didn't even know who to be more angry at, them for their blatant arrogance or at myself for allowing this to happen. Did you burn down my table? My voice sounded surprisingly even cold. We didn't think it was that important. Jake started, but I held up my hand, interrupting him. Just go away. At that moment, the doorbell rang, the locksmith came. I opened the door to let him in, and turned to my brother and his girlfriend. Your time is up. Amber glared at me, her lips pressed tightly together, her hands clenched into fists. I was expecting another scene, a new outburst of aggression, but instead she suddenly smiled, unpleasantly, with some kind of unkind triumph. You're going to regret this, she said, picking up the last bag and bumping her shoulder against mine as she left. Jake hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but when he looked at me, he changed his mind. He just nodded, as if saying goodbye, and followed her out. As soon as the door closed behind them, I took a deep breath, letting my exhaustion take over. The locksmith was already busy replacing the locks, and I slowly looked around the apartment, feeling strangely empty. The mess, the traces of someone else's presence, the things that had disappeared, all this seemed to leave invisible scars on the space that had once been my refuge, my pride. But despite this, a feeling of freedom that I had not experienced for so long was finally emerging in my chest. And even though I knew that this wasn't the end, that there would be new challenges ahead, calls from my parents, possible threats from Amber, the realization of a broken relationship with my brother, at that moment, I just allowed myself to close my eyes and take a deep breath. "Ruby," she began, and I immediately sensed that something was wrong. There was none of the reproachful harshness in her voice that usually accompanied conversations about Jake, no accusations or resentment, just a strange weariness and a kind of muffled anxiety. "It's about Jake. He's in the hospital." My stomach turned cold, my fingers tightened on the phone, and I automatically pulled the car to the side of the road, even though I was just driving along the usual route. "In the hospital?" I repeated, as if not realizing the meaning of the words. "What happened?" Mom sighed again, and there was a rustle in the receiver, as if she had handed the phone to her father or changed the position of the handset. "He got into a fight with someone, Ruby. He was badly beaten." I exhaled sharply and ran my tongue over my parched lips, feeling everything tighten inside. I didn't even know what to say. Jake wasn't a fighter. On the contrary, he always preferred to avoid conflicts, even if it meant that someone would take advantage of his gentleness. "Where is he?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it faltered anyway. "In the Central Hospital. My father and I are already here. The doctors say he's fine, but they gave him a few stitches, and—" Mom stopped, and then said something that completely knocked me off balance. "His arm is broken." I closed my eyes, feeling the anxiety spreading inside in a hot, heavy wave. Dozens of questions raced through my head, but most of all I wanted to know one thing. How did this happen and what does Amber have to do with it? "Where's Amber?" "Disappeared," the father replied shortly. "We tried to contact her, but her phone is disconnected." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling a shiver run through my body. It was so much her style. To leave at a time when it becomes too difficult, when circumstances require not only presence, but also responsibility. "I'll be there," was all I said, and I disconnected the call before Mom could add anything else. The road to the hospital seemed endless to me. Possible scenarios were spinning in my head, but none of them gave me a clear picture. Is Amber to blame for this? Or maybe Jake really got into some kind of trouble on his own stupidity. I was angry at him, angry for everything he had done to me, for the mess he had left in my life, but that anger didn't matter when it came to something serious. When I finally parked outside the hospital and hurried inside, the emergency room was pretty quiet. It was already past midnight, and the corridors were illuminated by a cold neon light. I quickly found the right room, and when I entered, the first person I saw was my father. He was sitting by the bed where Jake was lying, looking at him with an expression of anxiety I'd never seen on his face before. Mom was standing next to me with her arms crossed over her chest, and when she noticed me, her gaze softened. "You've arrived," she said softly, as if she didn't believe it herself. I just nodded and looked at my brother. Jake looked terrible. His face was covered in bruises, there was a purple bruise under his right eye, his lip was split, and his left arm was fixed in a cast. He opened his eyes when he heard my voice and looked at me with tired resignation. "Hi, Ruby," he murmured, and there was so much bitterness in his voice that I wanted to turn away. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask, to understand what had happened, but at the same time I couldn't shake the strange feeling that this was the inevitable outcome of the path he was on. "Are you okay?" I finally asked. Jake smiled weakly. "As you can see." Mom took a step forward and said softly, "The doctor said that he will recover soon, but he needs time to recover." I looked at my father, He was silent, but it was clear from his tense posture that he was also unhappy with the whole situation. Who did this? I finally asked. Jake turned away, and it seemed to me that he didn't want to answer. But then he sighed and spoke anyway. This is one of Amber's friends. There was silence in the room. What? I asked quietly, even though I already knew that nothing good would come of it. Jake ran his good hand through his hair nervously, as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. She borrowed money from him. A large sum. She said we'd figure it out together, but, in the end, she just disappeared, leaving me facing the fact. I clenched my teeth, feeling anger rise in me. And now what? I asked. Jake shrugged his shoulders. I do not know. He said he would come back for the money. I closed my eyes, realizing that this nightmare was just beginning. I decided that I would not rush to answer. I would let my parents stew a little in their own awkwardness, in this realization that came to them too late, and in the feeling of helplessness that they may have encountered for the first time in their lives. It was akin to how you call someone for a long time, but he turns away, and then, suddenly, when you no longer need his attention, he reaches out to you with belated regret. I wasn't going to take revenge or be cruel. I just didn't want to be the one who solves other people's problems at the cost of my own peace of mind anymore. It took 2 days before I sent a short message, okay. I'll be back on Saturday. But I won't interfere. The reply from Mom came almost instantly, thank you. We are glad. There was hope in those words, almost a plea. Saturday turned out to be cloudy, but warm. I chose a discreet dress, gathered my hair into a low ponytail and went to my parents' house. Already on the way to their house, I was overcome by a feeling of strange nostalgia mixed with anxiety. It seemed that this house, once filled with comfort and laughter, was now entangled in a thin web of tension. When I entered, the first thing I smelled was fried chicken with rosemary, my mother's signature recipe, which she always cooked when she wanted the evening to be peaceful. She met me at the door and hugged me tightly, but I remained tense, not responding to her as warmly. My father was sitting in the living room, holding a glass of water in his hands, and he didn't look his best. To put it bluntly, fatigue lay in his features, and doom could be seen in his eyes. How are you, Dad? I asked, taking a seat across from him. In different ways, he smiled bitterly. I try not to violate Amber's regime, so as not to cause her displeasure. Funny, isn't it? I tilted my head to the side. Just a month ago, I told you that she was exactly like that, but no one wanted to listen to me. Ruby, my mom began, but I held up my hand for silence. No, Mom, you said yourself that you were wrong. So let's at least not pretend that this came as a surprise to you. I noticed movement in the hallway. Amber was leaning against the door jamb, arms crossed over her chest, her gaze as arrogant as I remembered it. Jake appeared behind her, looking confused and a little exhausted. Well, Amber finally said, giving me a cold look. My sister is back. So all these dramatic scenes were just temporary? I laughed, jerkily, without real humor. Don't flatter yourself. I didn't come here for you or Jake. I'm only here because my parents finally realized what they had done. Jake sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Listen, Ruby. No, now you listen, I interrupted him sharply, feeling righteous anger boiling inside me. You always think that you can just say, listen, or, I'm sorry, and that will be enough. But you know what? Not this time. You chose this path yourself, you brought this girl into your world, you let her trample our family. You have to deal with the consequences yourself. Amber snorted, but I ignored her. Jake looked at me in silence, and for the first time in a long time, I saw in his eyes not just annoyance or self-pity, but something like understanding. Maybe even remorse. We have nowhere to go, he finally said softly. The apartments are expensive, but I can't afford a rental apartment yet. It's not my problem, I replied calmly. Just like my apartment wasn't your problem when you broke everything you could there and forced me to spend thousands of dollars on repairs. There was silence, and in that silence I realized that I was no longer in pain. I was no longer that confused, crushed sister who hoped for a little respect. I let go of that role, and with it the pain it brought. Mom coughed, breaking the long silence. Jake, Amber, her voice was firmer than before. You have to move out. We've given you enough time, but now it's time to find your own place. Amber jumped to her feet, her eyes blazing with rage. You can't just kick us out. Maybe we can't, my father said softly. But we will not put up with this state of affairs either. Jake looked at his parents, then looked at me. I could see that he wanted to say something, maybe something meaningful, but in the end he just nodded. I felt my body relax. I wasn't going to gloat, but deep down I knew it was justice. Dinner was held in tense silence, but there was a sense of change in the air. When I left, Mom hugged me again. Thank you for coming, she whispered. Don't worry, Mom, I smiled, getting into the car. Just don't make the same mistakes again. I drove home, enjoying the feeling of freedom. There were no more shackles that held me down, no more guilt that was imposed on me. I was living my life, moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, it was really easy for me.